1943. The skies over the Pacific belonged to them. Not a single Japanese pilot, not a single mechanic, not a single boy watching from below as the white sun glittered on the wings of the legendary Zero doubted it. These planes weren't just machinery. They became a symbol of the nation, a symbol of their own invincibility. Every takeoff was almost a ceremony, and every victory a confirmation that the samurai spirit could overcome any machine crafted by American hands. When the adversaries were discussed at the airfields, the Japanese laughed. American flying boxes. That's what they called the bulky, clumsy Allied bombers. They're heavy, slow, and won't turn in time even in the rain, the pilots joked, certain that any encounter in the sky would end the same way. A swift maneuver, a burst of machine gun fire, and another burning carcass plummeting into the sea. This self-confidence was fueled by victories. From the very beginning of the war, Japanese aviation had shone. Pearl Harbor had become proof for many that the East could crush the West, not only with willpower, but also with technology. The Americans, meanwhile, seemed to be just learning to fly, like children trying to tame overly complex machines. An atmosphere of pride and slight disdain pervaded the bases. Young pilots, barely having received their badges on their chests, already considered themselves chosen. Sky warriors whose mission was not simply to defend the empire, but to shape the fate of the world. In the evenings, they argued about speed, angles of attack, and the number of enemy kills, and each conversation ended the same way. The Zero is perfect. Everything else is a pathetic attempt at imitation. But amid this confident laughter, a chill occasionally flickered. One of the senior officers who had seen the front would quietly say, "Americans aren't that simple." They learn quickly. However, these words were drowned out by the roar of engines and the enthusiastic toasts to yet another victory. It seemed nothing could shake this sky, where pride soared above the clouds. But somewhere far away, beyond the sea, something was already being born that would change everything. A machine capable of flying so high that even the legendary Zero would be unable to reach it. And at that moment, when the Japanese pilots looked up at the serene sky, they didn't yet know that they would soon look upon it with an entirely different feeling, not with pride, but with helplessness. Long before the Pacific skies were filled with the roar of superfortresses, Japan's pride already had a name, the A6M-0, a machine created with an almost fanatical pursuit of perfection. In the late 1930s, the Imperial Navy demanded the impossible, a light, maneuverable, long-range, and yet deadly fighter. What Mitsubishi engineers managed to create was a miracle of its time. The designers saved every gram of metal, pushed aerodynamics to the limit, removed armor, sacrificing pilot safety for speed and lightness. The result astounded even its creators, an aircraft capable of flying farther, higher, and spinning in the air as if defying physics itself. When the first Zeros appeared over China, the world learned a new word, one that concealed an entire philosophy. These aircraft didn't just win, they humiliated the enemy, tearing apart heavy American Curtiss and P-40 fighters as if it were a game. The pilots believed they were flying not on machinery, but on an extension of their own will. The Zero became the embodiment of the Japanese soul, fast, flawless, fearless. Each new takeoff felt like a ritual, a pure form of service to the Emperor and the sky. Victories followed one after another. Singapore, the Philippines, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. Each operation reinforced the illusion of infallibility. Newspapers were filled with headlines, and in schools, children cut out paper zeros and shouted, "Banzai!" imagining their planes soaring toward glory. But even in these moments of triumph, warning signs flickered on the horizon. In the wreckage of downed American aircraft, Japanese engineers discovered new instruments, enhanced engines, and strange technical solutions never seen before. It seemed like a trivial matter, but gradually something began to change in the air. The Allies no longer flew as before. Their machines grew heavier but faster, slower but more resilient. And the Zero, despite its grace, remained vulnerable, lacking armor, lacking self-sealing fuel tanks, with an engine that lacked altitude. However, no one talked about this at the airfields. They continued to laugh, certain that no American heap of steel could compare to Japanese grace. No one wanted to admit that somewhere in the depths of American factories, something was already being born that would make all previous battles seem like a game. Pilots prepared for new victories, unaware that very soon they would have to look at the sky with the same horror with which their enemies had looked at them yesterday. The first alarming rumors came from the north, from the Coral Islands and Sakhalin. Patrol posts reported mysterious aircraft appearing at unprecedented altitudes. They flew too fast, too far, and too high for anyone to notice them clearly. Radio operators were confused in their reports, and pilots couldn't believe their own eyes. These shadows seemed to simply glide across the sky, leaving no trace or meaning behind. No one could even imagine that this was reconnaissance from a new era. The Imperial Army headquarters dismissed the reports. The Americans are incapable of creating something like this. Newspapers laughed at the reports, dismissing them as the fabrications of frightened pilots. Even officers who had observed the strange objects with their own eyes were reluctant to report them to their superiors, fearing ridicule. After all, not long ago, Japan considered itself master of the skies, and any threat from above seemed absurd. "We fly higher than anyone," the pilots confidently declared. "No one will dare look down on us." But on those nights when a roar unlike any known engine drifted from the coast, even the most self-assured fell silent. The air vibrated, as if the sky itself were tense with the presence of something invisible. No flashes, no traces, only a sound, deepening into the clouds. Occasionally, tiny shining dots could be spotted, hovering too high, almost at the limit of human vision. At headquarters, there was debate. Are these weather balloons or Allied experiments? The engineering departments believed the Americans were simply exaggerating their successes. After all, even the best Japanese engines couldn't lift an aircraft above 10 kilometers. What can we say about machines flying even higher, especially with bombs on board? It all seemed absurd. Propaganda, rumors born of war fatigue. But the more messages came in, the more uneasy they became. One day, radio interceptors detected a strange exchange between American frequencies. They heard codes they hadn't heard before, and mentioned something called Superfortress. The word caused confusion. Superfortress sounded too loud to be true, but the officers accustomed to disdain felt a slight tension for the first time. And then came the day when it all became reality. A dull, drawn-out rumble echoed over Japan, as if the sky itself were shaking. People in the streets looked up, but saw nothing. The sound was everywhere, and nowhere. And only minutes later, tiny silver dots flickered in the sky. They moved slowly, calmly, as if unafraid of interception or anti-aircraft fire. And when the first bombs fell on industrial areas, it became clear. This was no rumor, no mirage, no exaggeration. This was the beginning of something new. Then, for the first time, the Japanese pilots experienced a strange feeling. Not fear, not defeat, but incomprehension. They simply couldn't reach them. Their Zeros lost power long before the enemy entered their kill zone. The guns were silent, the engines choked, and above them, in the cold layers of the atmosphere, shadows passed, leaving behind not traces, but ruins. It was the first reminder that above pride, there is always a height beyond human reach. Summer, 1944. When the new American aircraft were finally seen not as silhouettes in the icy blue sky, but up close, on gun sights and in binoculars, it became clear. These weren't just any bombers. These were machines from another world. Enormous, sleek fuselages without unnecessary protrusions, long wings with neatly enclosed bays, turbochargers on the outer wings, forcing the air to obey. These planes rose to where the air no longer resembled air, and remained there calmly, as if the entire weight of their structure had suddenly become weightless. Inside, a completely different reality reigned. Pressurized cabins front and rear, connected by a narrow, airtight tunnel above the bomb bays. While Japanese pilots struggled with frost on their canopies and oxygen masks, in these American machines, the crews could work without trembling hands or gasping for breath, focused and calculating. The fighter, soaring to its maximum altitude, was literally out of breath. The Superfortress flew steadily, like a passenger train on the rails of the sky. The peculiarity that broke the usual logic of combat was its defense. Not open firing positions, but remotely controlled turrets, coordinated by targeting computers. The upper and lower mounts overlapped each other in sectors, transforming a rare approach into a tight arc of tracers. The gunner looked at the target through a stabilized sight, and the electromechanics calculated the lead faster than the attacker's throat could tighten. Trying to sneak up from below, the pilot came under fire from the lower turrets. Approaching from behind, he approached the tail section, where he was met with yet another ironclad patience, already honed by many flights over the ocean. The altitude and range made these raids inevitable. 4 piston-engine giants hauled several tons of cargo across half the sea and back. Where the Japanese relied on fatigue for aircraft and personnel, the Americans relied on logistics and calculation, new airfields, refueling, changing the flight profile, and ultimately, a smooth return to course. Below, anti-aircraft guns raged with short bursts, but their trajectories were short. Interceptors rose to meet them, and the most persistent one's sights faltered at altitude. The engine lost its breath, the controls became spongy, and the gunfire radiated into the void. The Japanese pilot's initial reaction was not emotional, but physical, an unpleasant emptiness in the chest from the lack of altitude, when you pull back on the stick and the ceiling is already near, a vibration that appears as a warning of impotence, an oncoming aircraft that is not only higher and further away, but also returning fire without revealing the people in the windows. The real shock came later, when it became clear that a single heroic dash wasn't working. Even if they managed to cut through the formation and get within firing range, the turrets would manage to turn and fire a burst, while the huge machine, seemingly oblivious to the hits, continued to hold the line. The usual hunt was non-existent. There was no nervous close combat, where the Zero would spin in place and win by turning. Here, the fight was dictated by speed, altitude, and the mechanics of fire, distributed among the aircraft like a single organism. For the first time in a long time, the Japanese pilots felt more than just risk. They were faced with the limits of their capabilities, beyond which mathematics, steel, and pump-maintained cabin pressure began. In the sky, where talent had once saved them, a completely different kind of strength was now required. That day when one of the groups attempted to take the Superfortresses head-on and was met with concentrated fire, it became clear. The old methods would not work. At the airfields, they discussed new high-altitude tactics, argued about approaches from above and below, and measured angles and speeds with a ruler. But even these calculations came down to a simple problem. They needed to reach them, hold the line of attack, and survive the response. And while mechanics tugged cables and replaced propellers, a new line was already appearing over the horizon, another formation, heading for a place where a regular fighter felt like a guest, not a host. It was at this moment that the war in the air ceased to be familiar, and a different one began, one where the air itself, altitude, and numbers favored those who knew how to control them. The first interception orders came with a sense of desperation, disguised as resolve. Squadrons were scrambled from every possible airfield, from the flat coastal bases to improvised strips carved out of mountain slopes. Pilots, once treated like aristocrats of the sky, now launched their battered machines with engines coughing black smoke, chasing specks that vanished into the blinding blue far above them. The radio crackled with confusion, altitudes misreported, bearings misunderstood, and half of the interceptors returned without ever even seeing their enemy. Those who did manage to glimpse the B-29s described them with a kind of haunted awe, massive gleaming silver hulls drifting high above the clouds, utterly untouched by the chaos below. The Japanese planes clawed for altitude, straining against physics itself. Engines screamed at full throttle, fuel gauges dropped like stones. Some pilots, realizing they would never reach the bombers, simply turned skyward and refused to descend, vanishing into the thin air where no machine or man could survive for long. Commanders tried to invent new tactics on the fly. They ordered vertical climbs from mountain runways, hoping to meet the bombers mid-route. Others attempted to ambush them at night, guided only by the glow of their exhaust flames in the upper atmosphere. Some proposed ramming, not as a formal doctrine, but as an act of frustrated rage, and a few did exactly that. Engines throttled forward, wings trembling, they aimed their fighters straight into the enormous shadows passing overhead. Yet, for every success, dozens of lives and planes were lost. The reports grew thinner, the victories more symbolic than strategic. One B-29 destroyed, a communique would say, but beneath that single line were 20 names that would never return. On the ground, entire cities began to vanish under firestorms. First Nagoya, then Osaka, then Tokyo itself. The sky that once belonged to Japan now burned red at night, a constant reminder that the war had climbed beyond reach. In the mess halls, silence replaced laughter. The pilots stopped boasting. They sat with eyes fixed on the floor, their once bright uniforms dulled by smoke and fatigue. Mechanics whispered about fuel shortages. Officers blamed the weather or bad intelligence. Anything but the truth, that no amount of skill or bravery could pierce the wall of altitude and armor the Americans now commanded. It was no longer a battle for dominance. It had become a slow suffocation, as if the sky itself had turned against them. Every takeoff felt heavier, every return lonelier. The proud wings of the empire were still flying, but no longer free. For the first time since the war began, the men of the rising sun looked up and felt something they had never known before: fear, cold and unrelenting, falling from the heavens like invisible rain. March 9th, 1945. The night began with silence. Then came the wind, and with it, the roar. A sound unlike any before, rolling in from the Pacific like a living storm. Above the blacked-out city of Tokyo, the sky shimmered with faint silver shapes, hundreds of them, drifting in perfect formation. The first flares fell quietly, almost gracefully, before the world split open. What followed was not an air raid. It was an elemental force, a man-made hurricane of fire. Phosphorus bombs rained down in endless waves, bursting on rooftops, in narrow streets, on wooden houses packed tight like matchsticks. The oxygen was sucked out of alleys before the flames even reached them. The air itself began to burn. In minutes, whole districts ignited at once, turning the city into a single, breathing inferno. People ran toward the rivers, thinking water would save them. But the heat boiled it, turning the surface into steam. Bridges collapsed, melted, or simply disappeared in the brightness. Entire families vanished where they stood, their shadows briefly etched onto walls before those walls too fell apart. Fire brigades never arrived. There was nothing left to save and no direction to go. From their unreachable height, the crews of the B-29s could see the glow spreading far beyond their maps, a pulsating red tide devouring the horizon. The turbulence from the rising heat rocked even those massive bombers. Yet, the mission continued. More waves followed, over Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya. City after city was erased not by precision, but by saturation, by turning the night itself into a weapon. Down below, survivors stumbled through the haze, blinded by smoke, deafened by the roar that never seemed to stop. Somewhere high above, the engines of the flying boxes kept humming with the steady rhythm of inevitability. The once confident officers of the Imperial Command listened to the reports with hollow faces. Radio operators spoke in half sentences. Communication lines broke down under the weight of panic. No one could say how many planes had come, how many were lost, or how many were still on their way. All anyone knew was that Tokyo, the proud heart of the empire, was burning. For the pilots still stationed on the home islands, the sound of those engines became unbearable. They could hear them even when the raids had ended, a phantom noise that haunted every sleepless night. The myth of invincibility, built on years of victory and sacrifice, was collapsing along with the cities below. The flying fortresses that once seemed distant and abstract were now gods of destruction, unseen yet omnipresent. And as the fires consumed everything familiar, Japan began to understand. The war had left the ground. It now belonged to the sky, and the sky no longer belonged to them. The order for a final response came when there was nothing left to respond with. By mid-1945, the sky over Japan had become an American possession. Every flight, every patrol, every sunrise began beneath the distant thunder of B-29 engines. In desperation, the high command turned to what was left. Young men barely out of training, outdated planes rearmed with explosives, and a single instruction: attack, no matter the cost. The word kamikaze carried the illusion of divine power, the divine wind that once saved Japan from Mongol invaders centuries ago. But this new wind no longer felt holy. It was dry, metallic, and filled with the smell of burning fuel. Pilots were told their sacrifice would turn the tide, that one body, one plane, could do what squadrons could not. And so, they climbed into cockpits stripped to the frame, engines barely holding together, and rose toward those unreachable silver giants above the clouds. Sometimes they managed to break through the escort lines, bursting out of the haze like sparks thrown against steel. The moment of contact, a flash, a shudder in the sky, was all that remained of their existence. Reports called them victories. Reality called them noise lost in the wind. For every B-29 scratched or downed, 100 more took its place. Meanwhile, engineers worked feverishly in underground factories, sketching miracles on paper. The Ki-84 Hayate, the rocket-powered J-8M Shusui, designed to climb straight into the heavens and meet the bombers head-on. But the machines that rolled out were fragile, rushed, unfinished. Engines failed, fuel mixtures detonated on the runway. The pilots who trained for them died before ever seeing the enemy. The dreams of counterattack dissolved into fumes before takeoff. On the ground, commanders spoke of honor, yet their voices carried the exhaustion of men who had already lost faith in the sky. The war was no longer about strategy or victory. It was about denial, about refusing to accept that the empire built on flight had fallen to gravity itself. Pilots who once celebrated takeoffs now treated them as farewells. The songs of glory had faded into static. The prayers whispered before missions sounded more like apologies than vows. From above, the B-29s continued their measured, unstoppable rhythm. The bombs fell with mechanical precision, indifferent to courage, unmoved by sacrifice. The world below was dissolving into smoke and silence. Even the act of giving one's life no longer seemed heroic. It was simply the last way to avoid seeing what the world had become. And yet, amid the ruin, the same thought echoed in every surviving cockpit and bunker. If the gods truly live in the heavens, why have they turned away? By the summer of 1945, the laughter was gone. The airfields that once echoed with songs and confident banter now stood quiet, littered with twisted metal and forgotten banners. The pilots who survived the endless missions no longer looked upward with defiance, but with an emptiness that mirrored the pale sky itself. The war was still officially raging, but everyone who had seen the burning cities knew the truth. It had already ended long before the word surrender would ever be spoken. The B-29 still came, steady and calm, not as enemies, but as a reminder, a relentless silver horizon that erased all illusions. They flew with the serenity of inevitability, their shadows gliding across what was left of the empire. Each hum of their engines was a verdict, each contrail a white scar over the ruins of pride. Japan's skies, once symbols of spirit and will, now belonged to machines that no human courage could reach. For the Japanese pilots who remained, that realization hurt more than defeat itself. They had built their faith on mastery of the air, the idea that the human soul, sharpened by discipline, could conquer anything. But these new machines had no soul, only systems, no fear, only precision. Against that, bravery became meaningless. It wasn't man against man anymore. It was belief against reality. And belief had finally run out of altitude. When the first atomic bombs fell, delivered by those same silver fortresses, the world itself seemed to pause. Even those who had sworn never to yield felt something collapse inside, something deeper than loyalty. The myth of the invincible warrior dissolved in the glare of a technology too vast to comprehend. No ritual, no sword, no oath could match the quiet certainty of science. After the surrender, the surviving pilots stood on the cracked tarmac and watched as American planes landed on what was once sacred ground. Some saluted out of habit, others simply turned away. The sky was no longer theirs, not because they had lost it, but because it had moved beyond reach. It now belonged to a new age, one ruled not by spirit, but by calculation. Years later, when the veterans gathered in silence, they spoke little of glory or hatred. They spoke instead of the sound, that deep, constant hum of the B-29 engines. It was the sound that ended their laughter, the sound that carried them from legend into history. And as the sun set behind the mountains, one of them looked up at the fading contrails and said quietly, "We thought we owned the sky, but the sky, never belonged to anyone. And in that silence, the silence after the roar, the last echo of an empire vanished, leaving only the stillness of a world that had outgrown its own gods.